what if you could get a little peek into the future of the global economy? Well, today, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're diving into a tale of three economic giants, and let me tell you, they are each pulling the world in a startlingly different direction. So, how do we know all this? Get this. Our source for this entire explainer is an edition of The Economist from the future, January 3rd, 2026 to be exact. And it lays out a pretty fascinating and honestly pretty fractured vision of the world to come. The main story here, the big takeaway, is that for the first time in a long time, the world's major economic engines, we're talking America, Europe, and China, they're just not moving in sync anymore. In fact, each one is facing its own unique, massive challenge that's sending it down a completely different path. Okay, let's dive right in. First stop, the United States. And the picture painted here isn't a simple story of boom or bust. Oh no, it's more like a precarious high-wire act, trying to balance some real economic stimulus against some really severe political instability. This slide just captures America's economic split personality perfectly. On one hand, you've got something called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, pumping $90 billion into the economy with tax rebates, and that's expected to give GDP a nice little 0.3% bump. But on the other hand, all that good news is getting canceled out by the mess from a 43-day government shutdown and the constant threat of new tariffs. And the source is crystal clear about where the biggest risk is coming from. It's not some market bubble or a banking crisis, it's politics. The threat of new tariffs, unpredictable appointments, it all just creates this huge cloud of uncertainty that no amount of stimulus money can really make go away. All right, now let's hop across the Atlantic to Europe, where the economic story is completely different. This isn't about high-level political drama. It's about a painful, everyday struggle where rising paychecks are basically being devoured before they can even hit your bank account. So on the surface, the news sounds amazing, right? The article says wages are going up at a rate of 4.9% a year. I mean, that's a pace Europe hasn't seen in nearly 40 years. In theory, people should be feeling richer than ever. But, and you knew there was a but, here's the catch. All that wage growth is getting completely wiped out by the high cost of, well, everything. Household energy prices, for example, are still stuck at around 65% higher than they were before the pandemic. So that big raise you got, it's pretty much just covering the cost of keeping the lights on. And it's not just energy. The housing crisis is still a huge problem, with the source pointing out that finding a place to live is, and I'm quoting here, if anything, harder than ever. So even with these record pay raises, the basic feeling across Europe is just one of being squeezed. Now for the third part of our story, and this is where things take a really dramatic turn. We're moving from the political tightrope in America and the affordability squeeze in Europe to a full-blown crisis unfolding in China. The absolutely spectacular collapse of its property market. I mean, the headline from this 2026 newspaper really doesn't pull any punches. Slapped down. It's describing a property market that's been falling for years with no end in sight. This isn't just a little market correction. This is a crisis that's shaking the very foundations of the Chinese economy. The scale of this is just staggering. Analysts in 2026 are forecasting that property values in some of the smaller cities could fall by another 40 to 50%. This isn't just wiping out wealth, it's literally erasing the life savings of millions of people. And you have to understand, this is not a short-term shock. This timeline shows a crisis that started way back in 2021 and is predicted to drag on all the way to 2030. It is a long, grinding downturn that's going to have huge consequences for China's growth for an entire decade. So let's pull these three threads together. You've got America, which is growing, but it's basically being held hostage by politics. You've got Europe, stagnating under the crushing weight of high living costs, and then you have China, just stuck in a deep, deep property crisis. So what does all this divergence really mean for the rest of the world? So here it is, the whole story in a nutshell. Three regions, three completely different realities. The US is looking at cautious growth, but it's all threatened by political risk. Europe is basically at a standstill, squeezed by the cost of living. And China is in a deep crisis, all driven by that property crash. The era of all the big economies growing together, well, it really seems to be over. And all of this leaves us with one final, really crucial question. For decades, the world has kind of relied on these economic giants to pull in roughly the same direction. If they are now all pulling apart, each totally consumed by its own internal battle, what happens to everyone else? And that is the very unsettling question our little glimpse into 2026 leaves us with.